Hello and welcome to the Conscious Consulting Podcast, where we will introduce you to the conscious consulting philosophy. Together with our senior advisors from all around the world, we blend the deep knowing of wisdom traditions, technology, modern science and business, and show you how to transform this wisdom into impact in your daily life as a consultant, leader or entrepreneur. Welcome to the CCG community. The real magic happens when you transform wisdom into impact. But have you ever wondered how to integrate your deep spiritual practice into your daily life? Me too. And that's why I invited our senior advisor Yingzhao Liu from Seattle to the podcast to ask her this exact question. Ying is a former director of design at LinkedIn and a living example of what integration means. Because at the time, as a leader in Silicon Valley, she also lived at a Zen Temple and studied ancient wisdom traditions. So instead of creating a typical work-life balance, Ying started to integrate these seemingly incompatible areas of life until they were inseparable. In this episode, Ying shares the story of assigning to a new culture, how she blended ancient wisdom with today's business world, and how that made her the extraordinary leader and advisor she is today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy a wonderful new episode of the Conscious Consulting Podcast. Hi Ying, thank you for taking the time to come to the second episode of the Conscious Consulting Podcast. I am super excited about our conversation today.
Hi Lisa, great to be here.
We have a lot to cover, but I want to talk to you about something in specific today. So your life is signed by integration and combination of different worlds. You grew up in China and then you moved to the US at the very crucial age of 18 and you have a deep spiritual practices and an amazing career in Silicon Valley in the tech world. Together, we will dive deeper today into integrating the wisdom, the spiritual practice into the modern complex daily life.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa.
So you were born in China and then came to the US at the age of 18. So I don't know about you, but I remember 18 as an age where you have everything figured out and where you think you know everything about life. And how was it for you to move to a completely different country and culture at that age?
So it was overwhelming. It was really difficult. I didn't have enough language. So the first 3 years, I really hunkered down and I was determined not to sort of sound forever like I'm fresh off the boat. I was really adamant not to have that handicap because I see my community, like my cousin who came to the US much earlier than I did, still have a very strong accent as an adult. So I sat down and did a really hard study of the English language, and luckily I'm very interested in language. So a few years later, people would comment on my language abilities, and that really was one of the first successes of my life, I would say, how I set out to do something and I was able to do it even though I didn't know if I could. So the rest of life was still really difficult, like getting a driver's license, having my first accidents and sort of being overwhelmed by the systems. But luckily, I do think the West, especially the US, is a really amazing place for young adults. There are so many opportunities. Where I come from in China, we didn't have libraries, so I was just amazed at the abundance that this place offered in terms of learning and in terms of teachers. The teachers at the community college I was going to were amazing, and some are still my mentors today, 25 years later. So I both benefited a great deal from being an immigrant, and it was a formational experience of my life in that it's one of the hardest things I've ever done is to assimilate and do my best to integrate into this culture. And I certainly still had my struggles in my 20s of being, after graduating from college, the sort of a sense of being lost and so on. And that's not so different from people who grew up in this culture. But I think being someone from a different culture, there's also another layer of finding belonging that is not a trivial thing. And back then, we didn't really have the language about diversity and belonging. So there's definitely unconscious and conscious bias in many levels, right? From, people on the street to workplaces. So there was a lot to navigate. And that did also form my own emphasis later when I became in a leadership role, how I wanted to create belonging for others who come from another culture.
And it's beautiful that you give now back what you have needed back then. Yeah. Where exactly did you go to university?
I went to University of California, Davis, and I studied design. So which is a generalist profession, which actually suited me well.
Okay, so design in which direction, or just?
Yeah, it was called environmental design, and the emphasis I chose were visual communications, which can be called graphic design, and also textile and costume. And then about the time I was graduating, the internet was just starting to come up. So I was lucky to also learn web design, and that became sort of my path in jobs, right? Like there were jobs in the web and technology, and not so much in theater. So I ended up in the digital realm, and then later became an interaction designer. And in many ways, that was actually good for me. The left brain and the right brain sort of working more in conjunction. And I am, it's partly the culture I come from, being very rational. It has taken me a lot of time, right? Like most of my life, to come to be able to consider my own sort of personal expressions as worthy of my time to craft it. So I needed to go through that sort of problem solving side of things first, and then come to the more mystical, magical part of expression. I work both in corporations and in design consulting. I really benefited from both worlds. I also did, I am a journalist, as I mentioned. I also did other roles, in particular outdoor education, or a better word for it is experiential education. So for maybe 14 years or so, this is a conscious role of bridging my cultures. I work for a company based in America that takes American teenagers and gap year students to developing countries, and their base is China. They've been doing that for more than 25 years in China. So I became their China director at one point, after SARS, actually, to rebuild their program. And that really benefited myself in amazing ways. I really learned much about group dynamics and leadership and basically coaching skills from that methodology. And I continue to work for them here and there. At one point, I also became a linguist, a translator, a certified translator, because that's another effort to not lose my language. And then a role at LinkedIn became possible, and it came through my contacts there about localizing the LinkedIn, basically the website and the app, into Chinese for the Chinese market. And this was a role that all the different things in my life comes together, integrated in a certain way. So initially I was talking to them about it doing it as a consultant. And I was in Seattle, they're in San Francisco Bay Area. I didn't want to return to the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm very attached to Seattle. But when I started to talk to the hiring manager about the role later, I was just buzzing with energy. And I realized this is something that is more than just a gig. And so I uprooted my life again, went to the Bay Area and, worked for them for 5.5 years. And, after launching the Chinese edition of LinkedIn, I started to manage other international teams. India, we also work on German, on German and other language editions of LinkedIn. So basically the international markets overall. And that was a really, really fun experience. Being able to combine travel with my work and being able to help young professionals around the world, both through the product and also directly as a manager, was really kind of a dream job for me for a long time.
So interesting, because I think as we discussed before, I think for many people that are like in between cultures, they hide their origin in order to like succeed in the new country, for example. But by embracing and living your identity, there were opening, some possibilities for you. So this is really interesting and a personal learning that we can take from that. So embracing their origin. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see most of the young people that I managed. The initial inclination is to assimilate, right? Is to adopt the Silicon Valley culture, and I'm giving them an alternative. I'm saying you can increase your range of possibilities, right? You can choose how you respond to situations in the moment, rather than feel that where you come from or how you have been is something less than.
I think this must be super important for a lot of people working there internationally. Speaking of Silicon Valley, at the time you have been working in Silicon Valley at LinkedIn, you have also lived in a Zen Temple.
Mm-hmm.
This was about 2013.
Yes, that's right.
Correct?
2013 to 2018 somewhere. Not completely continuous, but for the most part, I was residing at a Zen center. Like so many things, I'm grateful for the things that come to be in my life. Initially, because I was reluctant to return to Silicon Valley, I was just looking for a place to meditate. I had a sort of non-serious relationship with Buddhism at the time. I was simply interested in some of the wisdom. So I found this place that was in the hills, surrounded by lovely nature. And I went there a few times. I was so respectful that for the first couple of times, I didn't even step inside the meditation hall called the Zendo. I simply walked the grounds. But then over time, I kept returning. I did a couple of weekend self-retreats there. And the people started to say, why don't you live here? You seem like a good fit. And I said, no, it's too far to my work. It's about an hour drive. I don't have enough time to do more. I can't commit to the 6 I think it was 5:30 a.m. meditation time and etc. Right? So I was reluctant, but they keep suggesting it. And I thought, okay, maybe I should do the sort of months-long trial period because there's a trial period to see if it's a good fit anyway. So then once I tried it, it was like, something shifts from the inside. Time became more spacious. I did have less, quantity of time, free time, but the time I had, it was more meaningful. And that was a revelation. So then I stayed and I learned so much about myself, about practice, about communities there. And I'm still keen to continue in some way to create intentional communities. I think that's a not easy, but a very natural way for people to live is in community.
Yes, I can imagine. So two things. You said you were also interested in Buddhism before. Have you always seen yourself as a spiritual person, as a spiritual seeker, or did that arise some?
Oh yeah, quite late in my life, I would say. No, I did not see myself as a spiritual seeker at all. My father is a scientist. I grew up in a science community in China, kind of the MIT of China. So, if there is a religion, it would be science, right? And so it's actually very adamantly atheistic. And so I grew up basically as an atheist. And later I realized that I have an old soul, one would say, right? And I have a sense of mysticism, especially with nature, my connection with nature. I wasn't using language of religions with it at all, but I could feel something in nature that is more true to me than anything. And so then later when I started going to Buddhist talks, so just out of interest, I started to recognize that I understand what they're talking about. And so then over time, very slowly, I'm someone who is like a slow adopter in everything. Very slowly, I started to, take steps toward a spiritual practice and considering myself as a more serious student of spirituality, and not only of Buddhism, but also of Native American spirituality. So basically, old traditions. But it's very hesitant steps. But now, of course, like I am very committed to these practices, and I can understand that we all have that part of ourselves. It just, I grew up in a way that was that did not recognize that that what we call spirit coexist with everything, with mundane and rational and scientific phenomena.
I can relate. I can understand. So, and then you found this Zen Temple 1 hour from Silicon Valley, and then you chose to give it a try. And after the 1 month, you stayed there. How did your day look like back then?
Yeah, early morning meditation followed by what's called a service, which is a small ritual of dedication of the merit of the meditation. So, that there's meditation is never just for oneself, it's for the benefit of all beings. And then there's a little bit of what they call shoji, which basically means picking up. So like a little bit of chores of keeping up the temple. And then generally I go to work. And at the time, I was also riding a motorcycle. So it was an interesting transition as well from the mountains, the windy roads, which it was in itself a kind of ritual until you come to the concrete jungle of Silicon Valley. And then in the evening, there's another meditation session. Sometimes I cannot make that if I'm working a little bit late. We don't have generally communal dinners. It's really optional. So, but still, like in a communal kitchen, you come to the other residents. There's about 10 or so people. So, there's basically sort of, just improvise social time, and then the main coordinated or curated event is on Sunday, where the Zen Center offers a public program year-round, free of charge. So then there's 2 meditation sessions, meditation instruction, followed by a Dharma talk by a teacher or a resident or visiting teachers, and then a public lunch. So and then sometimes there's a guided walk in the nature afterwards, and people also can, do some volunteering, and a lot of fun and magical experiences happen then. So we take turns basically cooking that Sunday dinner, right? Like for 40 people or so. So there's some prep work to be done beforehand. So it was really a wonderful opportunity to join in sort of a rhythm of service and to learn how to do that for a community, for public.
But as it's still from the outside, it seems like those worlds are not combinable. Like it seems so different. And how did you integrate or balance those two different worlds, Silicon Valley and the Zen Temple?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think most people definitely viewed the combination of my life then as sort of something exotic and something that they are interested to have a view into, but they don't feel it's for themselves. And for a while, I did not talk about the Zen Center at my workplace. But then with my team, because I'm close to them, right, and I practice openness, right? That's how you model leadership, really. So I started to talk about some of it, and I also was I was having the learning myself that the meditation practice was changing how I would behave in very small ways at the workplace. I was more open. I was able to allow more pauses when there's a tension or some kind of discomfort in a meeting, etc. I was handling stress myself differently, and I was able to share that experience with my team just as they were happening. And then I started using some Buddhist language like basic goodness and the right response, etc. And so my team really took to it amazingly well. And then basically with their encouragement, I started to talk about it more and more. And I invited some of them to visit on Sundays and so, and then the rest of Silicon Valley was also basically starting to open up to this next big thing of mindfulness, right? And adopting from Asian wisdom, especially Buddhism. So I was just very lucky to be in that intersection a little bit before most people were. And I was able to live that duality. So I understand that desire for a different way of being for the people working in tech then, right? Because it's so type A, very driven, and they want to know that there's a different sense of space and a different sense of being, instead of just becoming always like efforting. So I understand the sort of the experience of being in both spaces, and I was able to be a little bit of a guide for some people. And I was also later able to speak about that experience, and which was useful for myself and for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I sometimes have the feeling that when you're like in this corporate world, there you have to give up every piece you have at the door, and then you walk in and have to be a different person. So I think it's super interesting to hear that you could take it with you inside, and also people benefited from your meditation as well.
Yeah, so I often contrast the concepts of balance and integration. So balance, for all my time in the US, people talk about work-life balance a lot, and I never could quite understand that because it seems like we're using the best hours of our days, right? Like, from 9 to 5 or 9 to 7 or whatever it is at work. So like, what are you talking about? That is life, right? There is no separation of work and life. So eventually I started to see this balance is a sort of a mental model that is actually slightly misleading, because balance, if you think about it, it's one side up when the other side goes down, right? So it's actually a zero-sum game. But life doesn't have to work that way. And life actually does not work that way. So my different mental model is integration. And the mental image I use is a drop of ink in water. And it swirls through all of the water, and the two become inseparable. And if you can picture a drop of ink in water, it has emergent properties. That pattern is beautiful and also unrepeatable. It's unique each and every time. So it's at a more complex layer than the idea of balance, which is linear and binary. So the more we can go to a more complex layer of thinking, the more it's actually accurate to how life operates. So the principle of integration for me meant a greater level of trust in the workplace, which, and I can give many examples of what that concretely means. One thing is to let go of things that I have done, but also to let go of things I have not done, right? The things I could not get to, right? Because we have so many thoughts, oh, I wish I did this, or I need to do this, but I'm not sure if I can get to it, etc. Right? There's only so many hours in a day. But to spend less energy on that cycle and just focus on what I am doing and trusting my actions more than my thoughts. And that was really, really freeing. It did free up a lot of energy for me to be more present with the people in front of me, the tasks at hand, and just let go of all the other what ifs. So that's one example. Another example could be, at a meeting, there can be a disagreement. And so, what do you do? Like, we don't actually concretely know with our cognitive brain what to do in that moment, right? And there can be a sort of awkward silence. So I started to just trust, if I feel impulse to say something, I will say it. I won't self-censor too much. And sometimes it's a recognition of, oh, you really want something, right? You really want something to succeed, right? Which is, later I learned this is very useful in coaching, for example, right? It's appreciation and affirmation. But then I was just going with my impulses, and I was able to lean in. And after that, often someone else would offer something, and then the energy would start to shift. So it's those kinds of moments when I started to have trust for the situation, and also trusting my own ability to respond to that situation in a helpful way, and not be attached to what actually happens, not to attach to like some kind of agreement or, to the agenda, right? To have intention, but not as much of an agenda. So those are, I would say, two examples of how integration or my meditation practice was able to help me specifically in the workplace.
Super interesting that you said meditation is not just for yourself, but for everybody around you. I never heard that before. Could you just explain this a little bit?
Yeah, I think many spiritual wisdom and certainly indigenous practices, they always have a connection between, I would say, the calling to sort of self-development and the calling to be of service to one's community and to the greater good. In Native American practice, the very difficult physical trials or challenges are only done with the service of, with the participation of people supporting you, what they call supporters. So the supporters and the questers or dancers, in the sense of Sundance, are deeply connected, and they even talk about the supporters are drinking and eating for the people who are questing, who are fasting, basically, from food and water. So, so it is very interesting. It is very interesting, away from the solitary and individualist pursuit of some state of being, right? And something for oneself. And that really changed. And that, for me also, I think as a woman, I feel more able to pursue these things, actually, because it's not just for myself. It gives me more permission to do it, because I can connect, right? This is not just for me. It does benefit other people in so many ways. And I've experienced it myself a lot as a supporter, both in Native American practices and in Buddhism. The retreats, for example, in Buddhism, called sesshin, in the Japanese Zen tradition, there's a lot of work that is done by the sesshin participants and also sometimes staff, but it's a work of love. And it all goes on silently and smoothly, which is actually really, really fascinating in terms of organizational behavior. And because it's emergence, people step in to do what's needed. I will also share in my travels, especially in India, some of the spiritual centers there are at a much, much larger scale than they are in the West. One of them has, for example, they feed 2,000 people at any given lunch, and it's all done by volunteers. When one volunteer is done with a particular task or feel like he or she needs a break, they simply tap on another person and says, "Can you step in for a while?" And so it's all like no hierarchy. It's all fully emergent. But Shangri-La, the hotel chain, has to come to this spiritual center to learn their best practices for how to orchestrate something so complex in such a short amount of time. So this is just really fascinating to me, right? But people are strongly motivated by a purpose of service. I think it's actually where we should move towards. And I see that also in the young people I work with. Money is not the main motivator. There's a sense of being connected to something larger, right? And to the people around them.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that is very, very important. And how did you cope with people and leaders that are putting that pressure on you and stress you?
We can't please everybody. So that is also a part of letting go, right? It's to be much less attached to what other people think of us. I recognize then that, some people, some of my peers could perceive me as this sort of hippie, right, in the corporate place. Even though I was still very sort of cautious about the language I use and how I carry myself. But other people really gravitated toward what I had to share. So I had enough positive data that I was fully able to let go of the negativity that I feel, because I realized the more I am who I am, the more polarizing I would be, and that is life. That is life. You cannot be a sort of lukewarm version of yourself. Does not lead to fulfillment for anybody. And the same thing was happening in my personal life. I realized, I think many people do on their spiritual journey, that some friends simply fall away because they don't connect with that deeper part of ourselves, and that's okay. I was able to let go of some circles and parts of my myself that I had that had previously been important to me, in order to make space for kindred souls that are my true the people who share on my journey, the travelers with me.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. You have to be relentless yourself to.
Yeah, and to let go. I think like letting go of what no longer serves is, both personally and interpersonally, such an important part of our practice, right? Life is coming through all the time. New things are emerging all the time. We don't have to worry about there being changes or changes that we want to see. I think the work always is more to let go of the things that are taking up space.
What is also very interesting is that it seems that questions you ask yourself from the outside, like I'm asking you right now, how did you integrate it, and how were people dealing with it? How did you cope with stress leaders? But when you live this authentic self, or yourself and your origin, then I think many problems are solving themselves, because when you raise your energy level, then it affects other people.
Yeah, and that's right.
And also, as you said, in the first place, first you thought that you don't have time for the Zen Temple and this practice and the meditation, but then time expands and suddenly it is possible. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, how did it affect your time?
Sure. I think a shorthand, maybe we can talk about flow, right? A lot of people recognize the experience of flow. And it's a concept that we understand. A lot of people understand, including lots of professionals. So I had the experience of flow in small ways. Sometimes it's in meditation, but oftentimes it's simply interpersonal connections. And that or even I think an experience that many people have too is when they do something really fully focused, and then they go and do something expensive. Like for me, that's often a walk in nature. You have a very different sense of it. This happens to me often. That when I take a walk after meditation or after really. So many times I have the experience that the nature that I was around was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, right? And it's the same thing I've seen 100 times, yet my experience of it is so delicious, it's so nourishing. And so, I know from my cognitive brain, like this is something worth looking into, or worth recognizing, so that I can have this experience when it's something that would serve me. So, and also in the workplace, right? Like, spend some time connecting with people for no reason, not just to get something done, but just to connect with them, right? After some sort of hard mental problem solving. It will feel, the contrast by itself would feel very rich. But it also often for me have a sort of deeply satisfying sense, a taste that I started to more consciously replicate.
What would you tell people when they say, I don't have time for this?
Yeah, so it's simply to recognize the things that we are already doing in our day that have that feeling, right? Like anything in our life is actually quite, have the feeling of ritual, like the experience of getting ready in the morning, right? It's actually a set of ritual that can take on a layer of feeling and significance if we simply have that intention for it to be. Really, all it takes is the intention. It can be useful to have a small gesture, like, facing the sun in the morning and just sort of have a sense of welcome, right? Or a lot of people have a sense of giving thank you at the end of the day, right? Whether it's around the meal or before going to bed. It's wonderful for people who come from a spiritual practice and they recognize the importance of being explicit about that intention. But for even people who are sort of fully pragmatic, like I was, right? Just noticing the times when you look out and you see the clouds, right? And you notice the details, right? And so just recognizing that's actually integration happening. That's our system finding connection to something very deep. In somatic practices, there is a way of scanning internally and externally. And it's so interesting that when we scan externally in what our surroundings are, we naturally notice the things that bring us comfort. Our system knows how to integrate, our biological system does. So it's simply to sort of, in the course of the day, like enjoy your shower, right? Enjoy the sensation of the brush on your hair. It's deeply comforting and pleasurable, actually. Enjoy the taste of the smell of food that you're preparing. Enjoy the sensation of the water on your hands as you're washing the dishes, and certainly enjoy the touch of the people around you, your kids, etc. Right? This kind of thing.
I was on your LinkedIn profile, of course. I did a lot of research. So I really want to read this because I think it is just one of many nice things former employees have to say about you. So this is one of them. Ying deeply cares about growing people and unlocking their potential to let them take risks, learn from their mistake, and find pathways that result in higher performance and engaged, fulfilled employees. In her day-to-day, she leads with what I'd call as the 3 I's: influence, inspiration, and impact. So as I said, this is just one of so many nice things people say about you and your leadership style. What does being a leader means to you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reading that as well. I'm very lucky to to be able to sort of help foster the growth of some young professionals, and that was it's a feedback loop, right? It's so fulfilling for me and helps my growth. The service is a positive cycle. Being a leader means to really support the people as a whole, right? To see who they are and to allow them to emerge, to allow whatever life wants from them to come forth. If I have a personal model, it would be this one, that I would remove the barriers of what's considered impossible so that people can be anything that they want to be. And to connect with our earlier topic about freedom, I recognize that much of the lack of freedom is actually self-imposed, or that we take the social structures around us and internalize it that we cannot do certain things. But at some point in people's journeys, I hope they recognize that's a choice, that we can be free to do anything that we want to do and fully accept the consequences of what that all means, right? Personally and to the people around us, and so on and so forth. And then life becomes an amazing expanse of possibilities. And I support people in that. And I would say that's my leadership style. And on a more concrete level, it could be to help them see problems at a different level, because there's never any shortage of so-called problems around us, but problems are opportunities, and there are challenges that shape us. So as a leader and a coach, I help people take a step back, right? Come to a different level of presence and look at that so-called problem, and see what it's offering to us. And often first of all, the somatic experience of the tension and the burden changes, right? And then the sort of possibilities really emerge, and that then life takes on sort of a level of richness. It goes on new directions, and it's often very, very exciting.
Yes, I love that. You're also one of the senior advisors for Conscious Consulting Group. How does your work as a leadership coach or as a senior advisor looks like?
It's to support leaders, again, to look at things at a different level. And I think leadership is such a rich journey for transformation, right? And because of the impact on teams and cultures, it's so it's very important, right? And we all recognize that leadership needs to look different. So it needs to be more inclusive. It needs to be more emergent. It needs to be more networked. It needs to be more feminine. It needs to be more indigenous informed. It needs to be more nature based, etc., etc. So I'm a fellow practitioner on the journey of how to be in a way that supports the world that needs to come, right? We cannot go on the same trajectory as before. So I think I can embody and support this way of being in today's complexity, and help people feel empowered and energized by the challenges, rather than burdened and sort of pressured and etc. So basically into their bigger selves. yeah, to go into the world of possibilities and go into the future. The what could happen is much more magical and much bigger than anything that we think we want. So we have to let go of our problem-solving mind into emergence.
I loved it. Loved it very much. At one point, you gave up your leadership position at LinkedIn. How did that come?
Sure. A lot of having to do with becoming a mother. And so I think in Europe, there's better social structures, right, to allow it's less than the individual nuclear families have to juggle this work-life balance thing, right, which is kind of a false promise. But yeah, without better social support, and all of our workplaces has to change in big ways. But yeah, the division of motherhood and a full-on work role is very, very difficult. And I became a mother fairly late in life, and having already established career, I recognize it's actually more important to me to not miss my daughter's childhood, right? And because it is, I really do believe this is as important a job as anything, is to parent one child, right? Because the ripple effects are endless. And that I could I could reintegrate with my career whenever I want to. I can often, this is also a useful pivot point for me, and which it became, right? Like I'm starting to be a fine artist, which is something I've always wanted to do since I was 5 years old as well. So then the next level of my engagement in the work world would look different because of my time as a mother and as an artist. So I chose to step away from my full-time role because for the most part in workplaces, part-time roles are not really possible at a leadership position. So, I could have really pushed the issue, but eventually this is not my battle to fight. I considered making it my change to try to push, but that I think that's a larger structural change that will happen at some point, but we're a long ways away from it, which is a more flexible workplace. The idea of feminine leadership is an important theme for now, right? And that's not exclusive to women. I think it's very. It's a very obvious with sort of mindfulness, etc. Really, we are talking about that we can embody both the masculine and the feminine sides and take from both sides in our roles as professionals and especially as leaders. I do think sort of the non-linear, more supportive, more compassionate, more community-oriented ways of a woman, which is also to say a mother, is very important as today's workplaces get more complex and more distributed, right? And less based on sort of some of the processes and psychologies that were part of the Industrial Revolution. We're in a different age now, right? And with today's young people, getting them to do a certain thing just for the company's bottom line doesn't really work. You have to support them as a person. They have different demands, and I see that. And so I think it behooves all of us to consider, and that's really a personal integration that each person has to walk, is the duality of the masculine and the feminine, right? Like that, no matter if we're cisgendered or not, that's part of the human life, is to recognize and to live with both of those polarities, and to take from those. I want to just say, for indigenous cultures, it's so interesting that there's respect for both genders equally. There's difference. It's not recognizing that women should be doing men's job and vice versa, but they have naturally different strength, but they're equally respected. And I think that is a key, is not to try to erase the boundaries, but to say that all the diversity is equally needed in the ecosystem. So I recognize the ways that I can be very masculine in my processes and also leadership styles even. But I am also a woman, and a woman from a somewhat more traditional culture, that I'm very mindful of people, that my default is to be as inclusive as possible, right? And able to compromise other goals for inclusivity. So I'm somewhat conscious of both, the different ways that I do things, and I'm also conscious of the discomfort that I feel of, is this more right? Is this more right? And I'm okay with that sense of ambiguity and ambivalence about how I should go about doing something, because the questioning is part of the practice, right? I allow myself to fail, because if you don't fail, you're not learning. If you don't fail, that also means you're not succeeding.
The question I want to ask everyone on the CCG podcast, it's the question from your perspective: what is the secret to a good life?
That's a great question. The secret to a good life is to recognize the magic of it, the miracle of it, I would say. Is not to be attached to goals. Again, what could happen is more magical and much bigger than what we think we want. But to let go into the infinite possibilities of being alive. And then life is incredibly rich. It's not easy. A rich life is intense and all-consuming, in the sense that it takes more effort than a comfortable life. It's a sense of like being a warrior on a battleground. It's going to take all of you. But a warrior on the battleground is joyous because he or she have trained all his life for this. So, and I feel that quite a bit. So that is stepping into the abundance of life and into I want to say not a dialogue, but like a full-on engagement with life itself, that I will give what life asks of me, and I will be presented with more riches than I could ever imagine.
So perfect last words for this interview. We will have follow-up conversations in the podcast, of course.
Yes.
So thank you so much for your time. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Conscious Consulting Podcast. If you want to dive deeper into the field of conscious consulting and become a part of our community, visit our website ccg-group.eu and subscribe to our newsletter so we can stay connected. You will find all the links in the show notes. We look forward to having you on board.